All right. Well, my name is Brian McNulty, and I am going to be talking about relapse, what that means. Um, First of all, um, when people try to define relapse, um, uh, with regards to addiction, obviously, we're talking about what? Does it mean the return to using a substance? Um, Even if it's a little bit, or is that a lapse? Does it mean being intoxicated or returning to problematic substance use behavior? Well, one of the problems with that is uh, really to understand relapse, you have to kind of recognize that it implies something. It implies that um, there was this problem, right? And then there was some recovery from this problem, and then the resumption of symptoms. So it implies that some sort of recovery has taken place. That's when we get into a maybe different viewpoint. Because if you think of addiction simply as a substance problem, then recovery would be abstinence, right? I'm not using. So simply then, relapse would from an abstinence-based model, relapse would be the return of the use of a substance or behavior with gambling, pathological gambling. Now, with obviously with the advent of the Human Genome Project back in '89, and the subsequent brain studies that took place for the last 15 years after that, what became understood was that addiction is indeed a brain disorder that affects the midbrain where the reward center is. Now, if we start to understand that addiction then is a brain disorder, um, hmm, and does abstinence actually treat the brain disorder? Because if that's the case, then sure. But if you have a brain disorder, and because of that brain disorder you're using substances to attempt to treat that, then abstinence does not treat it. Abstinence, just you're left with the brain disorder, the original reason that you first started using. So now, if we understand addiction as a brain disorder, then recovery would be treating that brain disorder and treating it adequately enough to where the person was not experiencing symptoms of addiction. Now, those symptoms are what we call low dopamine symptoms, and so when someone doesn't have enough either production of dopamine receptors available to see the dopamine, or enough time out in the synapse. I know it's kind of quick to blow through this, but when there's an actual problem with the levels of dopamine or dopamine tone, that ratio, then they experience life differently. And so treatment of a brain disorder would mean finding ways to treat those issues in the midbrain to stabilize it and increase that ratio so people can enjoy life, right? So they can experience life like everyone else in the world does. So if we designate addiction as a brain disorder and we treat that brain disorder and increase the levels of dopamine and how the person experiences life, relapse then would have to occur after that. And whether through medications or through or through a recovery program, those symptoms that were treated are now no longer being treated. The person returns to their natural state of low dopamine, experiencing life from that deficit perspective. And that would be a relapse. That would be returning to the symptoms. Now, how long they can stay in that state before they start using a substance or engaging in problematic behavior again, it really depends on the person. But if we simply go by it being a substance problem, we miss the entire issue that happened before that. So this is one of the reasons why it's important, if we're gonna give lip service to addiction being a brain disorder, then we have to talk about what that brain disorder is, how to treat it, and basically frame relapse from that perspective as well. Because simply saying, they used again, that's a relapse, is is difficult at best. What do you do? What do you do differently? How do you treat it differently? So reconceptualizing what addiction is, how to treat it, and then after that would be what happens when it's no longer being treated adequately, and it just seems to make better sense as to how relapse occurs, and even more importantly, how to combat it, and actually make progress in understanding what happens and how to prevent it from occurring again. So anyway, this is just kind of an introductory open discussion on stuff that pops in my head while I'm working on other projects. So anyway, my name is Brian McNulty. I'm an LPC from Mandeville, Louisiana, and this is just one of my first recordings of my brain ramblings. Anyway, thank you very much.